Hey guys, what's up? It's iFlynn here, and today I'm going to be ranking all of the Incarnon weapons in Warframe in the same way that I ranked Warframes in my last tier list video. To understand my position on tier lists in Warframe, that video is going to be linked down in the description below. Pretty much all of the Incarnon weapons are going to be among some of the strongest weapons in your roster. Weapons that have a niche are given higher ratings than weapons without niches, even if they might be worse than those weapons. This is simply because they bring your account something that the other weapons don't. For example, the Bratton Incarnon is unquestionably a better weapon than the Bronco Incarnon. However, the Bratton Incarnon is also a worse version of the Bursting Incarnon. If you have the Bursting Incarnon, the Bratton Incarnon loses its value, but the Bronco Incarnon doesn't. This is because the Bronco Incarnon can slot dizzying rounds, which you can then use to great effect on a frame like Araxia because of her easy access to finishers. So on my list, the Bratton Incarnon would place lower than the Bronco. However, Incarnon weapons are on an 8-week rotation and there's no shortcut to get them. If you have, for example, just missed week 6 of the rotation for the Bursting Incarnon, you still have good reason to pick up either the Dara in week 8 or the Bratton in week 1 to fill that slot until you can get to the Bursting. Unless you use Platinum, it's going to take you 24 weeks to get all of the Incarnons, which is almost half a year. This list is intended to inform you how to spend your time effectively for the sake of your overall account's health. Again, if we were to rank every Incarnon within the scope of all of the weapons in Warframe, pretty much every single one would be S or A tier. They're all fantastic, and even the ones at the very bottom of this list are better than 90% of all of the weapons in Warframe. That comes with the territory of having nearly 600 weapons in the game. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about the tiers. Excellent in all content, or S tier. First, we have weapons that are excellent in all content. These weapons are basically plug and play. You equip them, shoot or slash with them, and you'll have absolutely zero trouble with any content that you take them into, be it base steel path and all the way up to level cap. The Latron Prime. The Latron Prime with the Incarnon form is the best gun in the game. There's a million ways to run the Latron and they're all good. It's extremely easy to charge and has a generous battery pack of 40, which is really good considering each projectile bounces 6 times. You can run it as a pure utility weapon focused on armor stripping and viral priming while it gives you energy back with primary auxiliary. You can run it as a hybrid armor strip weapon where it can do good damage while still having that armor stripping potential. You can run it on grouping setups paired with the Cyoted or Ensnare where you would use Blast to blow everything up, and much, much more. Nothing comes close to the Latron, especially in terms of the amount of Omniforma that you're going to have to spend on it. Also, you want to shoot at the enemy's feet, not directly at them. The Latron is going to hit them twice if you do so. Bursting Prime. This gun isn't in this tier for its raw damage, its room clearing potential, its utility, or anything else. It's in this tier because of its Incarnon efficiency. It has a battery of 600 and the best fire rate mod that you can dream of since it gives you parkour velocity and a little bit of gas to give it some minor AoE. There's 2 main ways to run it. One is a raw damage crit monster that looks to kill mobs immediately by just shooting them in the head, and the other is a more traditional hybrid weapon that you can pair with a heat inherit epitaph to deal absolutely massive heat procs that will more or less instantly kill a level cap Demolist. The Geotoxicist has a spectacular Incarnon mode and a terrible Incarn off mode. Thankfully, it doesn't take a lot to get it into its Incarnon form, and it's got a decent battery pack of 270. Deadhead is amazing on this weapon because of its ricochets prioritizing headshots. This also means that keeping up galvanized crosshairs is extremely easy. On a normal dual Toxicist build, we only use one elemental mod, Prime Convulsion, because it combines with the Toxin element from Frenzy to give us corrosive. Punch Through is also an important stat to mod for because it leads to more ricochets. In addition to being one of the best ricochet pistols in the game, with secondary outburst, it's also the weapon for breaking Eidolon limbs. Nami Solo has a 1.0 follow through, absurd range, slap influence on it, play vault, hold melee, unga bunga, everything's dead. The Okina Prime is the best ranged influence Incarnon. The Seekers are going to crowd control enemies around you and proc magnetic, which is especially useful against things like Eximus and Frax. They'll also freeze enemies without overguard pretty much immediately. If you can outsource attack speed to something like Volt with his speed ability, you can drop the attack speed mod for Galvanized Elementalist or Magnetic Rush. It also has special uses as a movement stat stick for frames that don't use parkour to get around as much, such as Titania, Hildren, Jade, Araxia, etc. Speaking of movement, we have the Praetos. The Praetos is the best movement stat stick in the game, providing absurd parkour velocity and general movement buffs. It also isn't bad at taking out the weaker enemies in the game if you mod it right. You can easily take the Praetos to level cap. Excellent in specific content or A tier. The next tier is for weapons that are excellent in specific content. You may have noticed a few pretty crazy emissions from the previous tier, but don't worry, this is where we're gonna get into why I excluded those in this category. The Strum Prime is one of the best level cap weapons in the game, but it actually struggles in base steel path because it literally just kills too quickly, meaning you struggle to turn on your Incarnon form. Now, this is a pretty good problem to have because you're killing the enemies fast, right? But because you can't turn on that Incarnon mode, you're better off using a different weapon that gives you AoE or beam-like capabilities. The turret is probably the single best base steel path weapon in the game, however, it has a difficult time scaling into level cap. It's really versatile, really good at clearing rooms with a corrosive and blast build, and it's just really good at killing the corpus as well because of the beam being pure toxin. However, whenever it comes to endurance though, it starts to fall off a little bit. This is partly because you can't really scale it with the likes of galvanized aptitude, partly because the innate toxin is always going to mean you have a much lower heat weighting than you'd like to have. It is also just the nature of being a beam weapon. A lot of your damage comes through status effects, and that's not so good here. Make no mistake, it's going to kill level cap fodder enemies, but it's not going to do so really quick, and it's not really going to do much to a lot of the stronger enemies like a Frax, for example. At least not alongside something that's going to buff up the damage like a Saren or a Vault. The Furus is the best single target killer in the game. You can run it in a lot of different ways because of how versatile it is when it comes to the arcanes that you can use. You can make it a crit monster with secondary outburst, make it extremely consistent with Cascadia Flare, absolutely wreck Frax Overguard enemies with secondary Fortifier, or you can even use secondary Encumber when facing Demolist to scale Galvanized Shot to absurd levels. The main downside of the Furus is its short range, relatively poor Incarnon battery, and pretty bad Incarn off mode. When you've got the Incarnon turned on, it literally overkills enemies. You deal so much damage with this gun, but it really struggles when it comes to big groups of enemies. So really good single target, really bad at killing big groups. One of the OG Incarnon weapons, the Latum, is still one of the GOATs, even if we have moved away from using a non-crit Latum. You want to build it for elemental damage and some crit, then using overwhelming attrition and fortifier to delete Eximus and Frax enemies like nobody's business. Enervate Latum builds are also really strong in disruption style missions. The main benefit of the Latum is that it has a non-kill contingent 1200% base damage evolution, which is extremely strong for its neutral game. This makes it very, very easy to mod and lets you run almost any arcane that you want. The main problems with the Latum are that it takes much more time to charge its Incarnon battery than most other Incarnon weapons, is reasonably single target, and it doesn't have the Incarnon efficiency of, let's say, a Burst and Prime, for example. The Adamus is basically the secondary version of the Taurid, except unlike the Taurid, you generally want to keep it in Incarn off mode rather than Incarn on mode. Once again, much like the Taurid, it isn't a huge beneficiary of Galvanized Shot because it's going to generally only apply 2 status effects, and its Incarnon mode doesn't benefit from Galvanized Shot at all. Since it's base heat damage and it has access to Prime Heated Charge, it can be quite strong on a viral or corrosive and heat setup. You can also go ahead and run Corrosive Blast on it as well, like the Taurid 2. This weapon basically shares the same positives and negatives as the Taurid Incarnon, so it's going to do good versus a big group of enemies, but it's going to do pretty bad on those single target, like heavier enemies. Excellent with proper investment or B tier. The next tier is for weapons that are excellent with a proper amount of investment, and with that amount of investment, they can outshine weapons 2 tiers above them. The problem is that you generally need to dedicate a much greater portion of your loadout to maximizing their potential than you would with the tiers above. If you don't do so, you're not going to get much more value out of them than the weapons a couple of tiers below them as a general rule. The Dread Incarnon acts like a Plasmor bow that is a side grade to the Naderic most of the time. It can be modded in the exact same way, but there is one very specific way that we can use it to make it pump out big damage. However, this setup requires external priming, needs a source of external elemental damage such as Nourish, Venom Dose, Shock Trooper, etc., and is most comfortable on a frame that can already source its own invisibility. These are a lot of conditions that need to be met, but when the stars align, paired with Arcane Crepuscular, this weapon can go ballistic. The Sybaris is a gun that is starved for mod slots, but but it can be still extremely powerful at room clearing. Blast status effects on the Cerberus are forced, and there's no way to scale blast without elemental mods, so we instead run a corrosive cold setup and take advantage of primary frostbite for more multi-shot and crit damage. An epitaph doing some viral priming for you can really help this weapon. However, if you really want it to shine, you need to run both Arcane Acceleration and Arcane Rage. You need Rifle Elementalist, and you want to use Roar as your Helmuth ability. This is a problem because Blast also really wants you to armor strip to do as much damage as possible, so ideally you want to use a frame that can do all of that and also subsume Roar. The Magistar has a big slam. It's a big damage hammer, basically. With the slam changes, you can get an absurd amount of range on your slam attack. However, to make this effective, you need to be running both of the Nira mods on your Warframe, as well as Arcane Fury on the frame, and maybe 2 or 3 purple crit damage shards. So this is a very high investment build. It's not necessarily necessary, but to deal millions upon millions of damage, this is what you gotta do. The Hate is another weapon with serious mod slot issues. Burning Hate is simply too good of an augment to not use since it's multiplicative to all other forms of damage. On influence builds, we need to outsource our attack speed and make sure that we have a source of heat priming to get as much value out of the Hate's augment as possible. If you want the projectiles to do any meaningful amount of damage, you also need to run a universal base damage source like Vigorous Swap, Arcane Arachne, or abilities like Amp. This is because the explosions and direct hits don't benefit from mods like Prime Pressure Point or Arcane Fury, and the mini explosions, they don't benefit from Condition Overload. The Enotum is sort of a Nami solo at home weapon most of the time. It's a big stick dagger with a long range, but a lot less than the Nami solo. It has 0.9 follow through instead of 1.0, making it comparably worse. However, the Enotum does have a few tricks that the Nami solo doesn't. First of all, it can shoot contagion-like projectiles while you aim glide, except unlike Exodia Contagion, you can shoot continuously as long as you're in the air. The second and much more important trick is its synergy with 2 weapons, the Cyotid and the Argonac. With its Incarnon, we get 4.8 meters of range, which is comfy enough given that we're gripping with an ability or the Cyotid. Thanks to the Argonac and its Amalgam mod, all enemies that are gripped up will be stripped of their armor pretty much immediately as you strike them with the Enotum, thanks to these overlapping gas clouds that we can throw onto the weapon. The Acres are a very strong but very annoying melee because we are forced to mod for external attack speed if running Influence, since there's no space for attack speed thanks to their innate toxin. Still, they're a very good weapon on the right Warframe. The Ickers are outstanding on a frame like Saren, who can use Prime Fever Strike and Toxic Lash to scale the Ickers puddles, making them extremely potent. Another option is to run Exposure on them and build them like a normal melee with Prime Fever Strike, though this does make them lose a little bit of their AoE capability. Next up, we're moving into the C tier, and this category is called Great, but with a specific and powerful niche. This doesn't mean that they are necessarily better than the weapons in the tier below, just that they open up some playstyles that weapons in the tier below might not. They also might not require as much setup as weapons in the tier above them, which can make them outperform those if you aren't catering your entire loadout towards those weapons. If the Miter had 40 in its Incarnon battery rather than 20, this would probably be a meta-defining weapon. As it stands, it's sort of just a worse Latron that still hits 100% crit and status very easily, and is still one of the best guns in the game. We are talking about Incarnon weapons after all. So what is its niche? If you're doing a Fisher and you're running a frame heavily reliant on ability upkeep, the Miter serves one outstanding purpose: completely destroying nullifier bubbles with no fuss, neutralizing justice on frames with micromanaging kits like Zaku, Gyre, and Sight, and so on. This can be a godsend. So if you have a free primary slot and you don't want to deal with getting your entire kit shut down because of one persistent nullifier, the Miter is a great way to do that. The Paris is basically your standard Plasmor bow, similar to a normally built Dread, Naderic, or Cinta, and will perform similarly to them at a similar point of investment. However, the Paris also has a niche that the others don't: its incredible synergy with the Mecha set. Mecha Overdrive gives your companion 60% of your primary weapon status chance, and the Elemental Balance evolution gives the Paris an astonishing 80% base status chance. Once you load it up with as many status chance mods as possible, it even has an Exilus mod called Bisaj Bal, which gives it extra status chance on Hunter Track, you'll have turned your pet into a walking nuke. The Sicarus Prime is basically a slightly worse dual Toxicist most of the time, just because it doesn't have great Incarnon efficiency. However, its primary fire is substantially better than the Toxicist, which gives it a big niche in the current meta because it's the go-to profit taker pistol thanks to its high crit base damage and fire rate. While the kunai are perfectly respectable weapons on their own merits, they have a very powerful niche of guaranteeing a Zada bubble on the head of a target that you're shooting at. This is because kunai Incarnon shots will always seek the head of the target that you're shooting. The Bronco is a weird weapon, and there's two ways to run it. The first is a way to stack melee crescendo. Dizzying rounds opens enemies up to finishers, so you can use that to really easily stack your crescendo to maximum with no fuss. You can then take advantage of your melee's permanent 12x combo with secondary outburst to have a pretty strong pocket delete button. The other way that we can run the Bronco is as a primer. Because of its enormous multi-shot and sky-high status chance per projectile, when pairing the Bronco with Punch Through, it becomes a reasonably strong AoE primer that also opens up enemies to finishers with a Warframe like Araxia, Ash, and so on. Build the Furex Wraith as a normal influence melee, but use Amalgam Furex body count to add fire rate to your secondary weapon. And that's basically all there is to say about the Furex Wraith. The Ceramic Dagger is a weapon that's a buggy mess. It's terrible on star chart because you need to stack gun and blade, which means it's pretty much limited to endurance. So I'm about to say a bunch of words relating to how the Ceramic Dagger outputs damage, and a lot of it might not make sense, but just try to follow along. Prime Pressure Point doesn't affect the thrown Spectral Dagger damage, but Condition Overload is multiplicative to base damage sources like Vigorous Swap, Arcane Arachne, Amp, and so on. However, Condition Overload also fully ignores the damage from gun and blade and is additive on base melee hits. The weapon has problems. Still, it can be very effective when set up just right. The daggers can headshot and pair extremely well with Zada's Whisper, and the crit damage value that we get from Dodie can spike to truly incredible heights when considering the crit tiers that we're going to be hitting with it. It can also permanently sit at 12x combo quite comfortably, making it a great pairing for weapons that use secondary outburst. The Ruvox is a surprisingly excellent weapon because of its ability to spread electricity through impalement and to make enemies more vulnerable to status damage. Impaled enemies basically function as totem poles that spread electricity to every enemy that enters the radius. Slams don't benefit from Condition Overload scaling, so use Prime Pressure Point instead of Condition Overload. The only reason that we are ever normally punching is to build the Tennokai to spam Slam. The Prismascana is a serviceable influence weapon, but it doesn't really have anything about it that makes it compelling to pick over like literally anything else. But it does have its use when you're farming Endo on Voidunoi as Korra for just slicing up all of the enemies. This weapon could be in the tier below. It could go into great but with better alternatives, but because it's got that use in Voidunoi, that's why it's here. Great but with better alternatives, aka D tier. These weapons are all genuinely really good, and just because they're here, it doesn't mean that they're bad, it just means that they're pretty much outclassed by everything else, but with a nice enough investment, they're still going to perform in pretty much all the content in the game. These weapons don't have a niche, nothing that really makes them stand out. They are Incarnon weapons at the end of the day, so they are still going to be pretty good. To help save you some time, I'm going to start with some of the unique weapons and then group the ones that play a similar role. The Akin Brunt is a weird fusion of the Hate and the Enotum, but doesn't really do what either of those weapons do as well as they do them. It can chuck heat-based projectiles while aim gliding like the Enotum, which is nice, but the Hate only needs to use normal combos to throw out projectiles, and the Enotum can synergize with the Argonac for armor stripping. The Boar is a truly fantastic weapon, however, as a shotgun, it isn't necessarily as strong as the Strun or the Felarx. It gets outclassed by the Strun and the Felarx in the normal shotgun mode, and then in the Incarnon mode, the Boar turns into a beam, and that's where the Torah just outclasses it. Much like the Akin Brunt, it suffers from being a little bit too versatile for its own good. It's good in both categories, being a shotgun or a beam weapon, but it's not the best. Next up, we've got the Despair Incarnon, and we can closely compare this to, let's say, the Atomos in its Incarnon form. The Atomos is just straight up a better weapon. That's just it. Like, it's just better than the Despair. The Despair is cool, so if you want to use it, go ahead and use it, but Atomos basically does the exact same thing, just a lot better. Next up, we're going to be talking about the Lex Prime, and with the fall of the slash meta, the Lex has suffered a great deal because it can't use hemorrhage as effectively as it once did. Outburst helps it a lot, but not having multi-gun condition overload like most plasmors means that it falls off heavily in an endurance mission. The Prisma Angstrom is fantastic, it just simply isn't as good as something like the Geotoxicist or the Sicarus because it doesn't have something like tracking projectiles. The Dara, Boltor, Bratton, Fenmore, all fantastic weapons, however they're competing with the Burston Prime Incarnon. The Bow Prime and the Phallus, these are the big sticks, and they would be good if they didn't have terrible follow-through. Thanks to this, you're better off always running something like the Nami Solo. That being said, the Bow Prime does have a really high status chance, so if you could get yourself a negative impact ribbon, it could be 3 times higher, and you have an insane influence stick. The Velarks, Fasto, and Leto, they can be built to be incredible delete buttons, but none are as good as, let's say, the Furus, for example. The Velarks Incarnon mode is pretty bad. You're better off just keeping it in its shotgun form. The Vasto is fantastic, but the small magazine size hurts it a lot. And the Leto has pretty much all the same issues as the Boar. It's trying to be both the Geotoxicist and the Furus at the same time, and it just doesn't work out. Next up, we're moving into the F tier, and this tier we've titled If You Enjoy Them, Go for it. In this tier, these weapons are pretty much only outclassed by all of the other Incarnon weapons, which again, doesn't mean that they're bad. They're still really good. They are Incarnon weapons, but they are some of the worst Incarnon weapons. So first, we're going to talk about the Anku, which is actually quite good with melee Dodi. However, it's outclassed by Affliction's Hate for non-influence hack and slash, and the Harmony for heavy attack spam. Still, it can be quite a fun weapon. This is a really sad one, the Soma Prime. Sadly, it just isn't it. The Incarnon form is actually worse than the Incarn-Off form, and the Incarn-Off form isn't good enough to compete with something like the Burston Prime Incarnon. The Gamma Core is simply just a worse Atomos. Its gripping capabilities are just straight up worse than that of the Cyatid, so it's not really worth using. And the Zylok is another one of those weapons that is pretty buggy. It's got awful stats, it feels pretty bad to use, and it's not really a good AoE secondary. Like, if you want to use it, you can, but you could use then, of course, the Atomos with its Incarnon form instead. The Sestra is actually a pretty good weapon, it just suffers from an identity crisis. Its base form has no crit chance to speak of, and its Incarnon form has 50% base crit. This means that its final evolution has you in a little bit of a pickle. Fixing the base form's crit chance doesn't really benefit the Incarnon mode, and using secondary Enervate alongside the crit damage multiplier is great for the base form. But that doesn't really help the Incarnon form since that can crit consistently anyway and doesn't need Enervate. Still, on a frame like a Shield Tank Gauss or a standard Haro, it can still do really well thanks to its sky-high crit multiplier. However, its base damage is so low that even if it does have an excellent crit multiplier, it doesn't have a ricochet effect or anything like that, and the damage just isn't high enough to compete with something like the Latum. The Onos needs to be modded for so much fire rate to be usable. It does have one niche which it ignores Necromech damage attenuation and Sanctum Disruption, but even still, a gun like the Latum might not ignore that damage attenuation, but it just does so much more damage that it's not even funny. The Cybeer is an abomination of a weapon. It's supposed to be a slam melee, but it's a terrible slam melee, and it can't really be an influence melee because it has innate cold, which greatly reduces the mod space that you've got. Its crafting costs are insane, and it's outclassed by pretty much everything in the game. I think I kind of lied a bit. I think the Cyber is probably like just a bad Incarnon weapon, now that I think about it. The Gorgon is basically a less flexible Stelta, since it can only fire off projectiles like the Stelta's alt fire while in Incarnon mode. It's got the same problem as the Suma, where using it as a normal assault rifle is better, but it just lacks the base damage to compete with something like the Bratton or the Burston. And that's my Incarnon weapon tier list. Anyways, guys, that's gonna be it for the video. If you liked the video, hit like. If you want to see more Warframe content from me, hit subscribe. And if you have any questions, suggestions, drop a comment, hop into my Twitch streams, join our community on Discord, and become a channel member for early access to all my upcoming videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.